This is the first in a 4-part series which tells the story of the 2nd Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment's role within Operation Michael, that being the opening phase of the 1918 German Spring Offensives. It will also include reference to the activities and events elsewhere on the battlefield, as they had an impact on what would happen later in the Bedfords area of course, but as so much happened during the battle, to keep this to a watchable length I've had to cut right down on the content. And for that reason, just 18 Corps, which included the 2nd Bedfords, and 19 Corps directly to their north feature in this series, although several other British Corps were of course involved in the fighting in their own sectors. And that's a real shame, because it's a remarkable story, so would be well worth including all of the detail. It's also worth pointing out that this is not a typical Great War battle by any means, and once the initial phase of trench warfare was over, events became obscure. So piecing together this sequence of events from war diaries has taken months. Been absolutely fascinating but very tricky. The build up to the German spring offensives is well covered elsewhere, so these are purely the salient points intended to provide just enough context for this story to make more sense. 1917 had seen the Russians knocked out of the war, and the French army was on the back foot following a series of disasters. Although America joined the war, they were still building their forces up, so were not expected to join the fighting until mid-1918 at the earliest. So, with the Allied nations on the back foot, it fell to the already worn British and Empire forces to hold the line until American units could arrive. After heavy casualties over the first 3 years of the war, which had resulted in German manpower exceeding the Allies, early in 1918 the British army was reduced in size, as there were nowhere near enough men to fill the structure as it existed on paper. The 57 infantry divisions of the British Expeditionary Force in France was more than 70,000 men short. To address this situation, instead of disbanding the 15 divisions that would be required to provide enough troops to bring the divisions in France up to strength, the traditional 4 battalions per brigade structure was reduced to 3, along with changes to the upper age range of those fit for overseas service. As if that wasn't enough, at the same time the British Army took over a large stretch of the Western Front from the French Army between north of Saint-Quentin and south of La Fère, and had to set about organising it for their own style of defence. A prodigious effort was put into building the defences, but they were simply not ready in time, and in some areas trenches were only 18 inches deep or non-existent, and there was not enough barbed wire to cover them. Although comprised of experienced divisions and commanders, the troops given the task of manning the new sector were far too thinly stretched and had very few reserves available to them. A style of defence new to the British was also introduced, known as defence in depth. Using the 90th Brigade sector as an example, in each brigade sector a forward zone here was manned by a single battalion and was essentially an outpost line, with the area set up for defence only ever intended to delay and disrupt the attackers, giving the units behind enough time to deploy into their battle positions and then pull back when pressure was brought to bear. The main battle zone, with the 90th Brigade holding the north here and the 21st Brigade holding the south here, was where the British intended to fully engage the German assault. A line of forward positions, shown here, each garrisoned by a company and well sited for defence, was supported by a counter-attack position, also a full company, with the final company and battalion headquarters behind them. The battalion keep was sited for an all-round defence and intended as a fallback position should the forward companies be overrun. Looking at the entire 18 Corps area here, some miles behind the battle zone was a rear zone, the 30th Divisions being here. The rear zone was also intended to be capable of resisting the assault to the same degree as the battle zone, but in reality these areas had not been completed and were often no more than posts and tape marking the intended locations of trenches and dugouts. Although the troops were rigorously trained from the top down on how to operate within the new system, there was not quite enough time to be completely used to it. After the German forces on the Eastern Front had defeated Russia in 1917, some of their prisoners of war can be seen here, their eastern divisions were available for the German war effort elsewhere. Experienced, impressively trained and highly motivated after their victory, they were almost all moved to the Western Front and intended for one final, decisive attack on the British and French lines to finish the war off once and for all, before fresh reinforcements from America could be brought into the line. So the decision was taken to attack the British lines at their weakest point around Saint-Quentin. So that's enough of the general background information, and now on to the Bedfords and the units within which they sat. The 2nd Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment was a regular battalion which, although the regiment itself hailed all the way back to 1688, the battalion itself had been formed in 1858. Interestingly, the mounted officer shown here is the then captain, John Trail, leading his company during a march in 1905. He was in command of the 2nd Battalion when killed in hand-to-hand fighting on the 30th of October 1914 during the First Battle of Ypres. which unfortunately was the day of his 49th birthday. The 2nd Bedfords had been fighting on the Western Front since 1914 and had been engaged in the early 1914 and 1915 battles, initially as a part of the 21st Brigade in the 7th Division. The entire brigade was moved into the 30th Division following a reorganisation triggered by failings at the Battle of Loos in 1915. Fighting in the 89th Brigade during the battles of the Somme in 1916 and at the Battle of Arras and the 3rd Battle of Ypres in 1917, the reorganisation of the British Army in February 1918, mentioned previously, saw them moved into the 90th Infantry Brigade, still within the 30th Division. Their division was one of 4 collectively forming XVIII Corps, with 3 in the fighting line and 1 in reserve. The 61st Division held the northern sector, with the 30th Division in the centre and the 36th Ulster Division in the south. The 20th Division had been held back in GHQ reserve at the time battle opened. By March 1918, the 30th Division was made up of the 21st, 89th and 90th Infantry Brigades, each with just 3 battalions following the reorganisation of the British Army. The divisional sector was due west of Saint-Quentin and organised into 2 halves. The 90th Brigade, manning in the north, and the 21st Brigade in the south. The 89th Brigade was stationed as Corps Reserve when battle opened, in and around the village of Vaux. All of the battalions in the 5th Army's forward area, the forward, battle and rear zones, only sent a maximum of 21 officers and 620 other ranks into the fighting line, the remainder being held back at Villers-Saint-Christophe, each battalion's surplus forming its own company, along with other battalions' details from other divisions within XVIII Corps. It's also worth mentioning that around 1,700 to 1,800 men were on leave from the division at any given day, so reinforcements would have trickled back in as the battle developed. On the opening day of the battle, the 90th Brigade's strength was as follows. The 16th Manchesters held the forward zone and had a fighting strength of 23 officers and 717 other ranks, although just 21 officers and 620 of those other ranks were in the line, the remaining 2 officers and 97 men forming part of the divisional reserve at Villers-Saint-Christophe. The 2nd Bedfords were in the main battle zone, with a fighting strength of 19 officers and 748 men. 19 officers and 620 of those other ranks were in the front line, the remainder being held as divisional reserve. The 2nd Royal Scots Fusiliers were just behind the Bedfords as the battle zone reserve. They had a fighting strength of 19 officers and 670 other ranks, with all 19 officers and 620 of the other ranks in the line, the remaining 50 other ranks held back as a divisional reserve. This is the 90th Brigade battle zone, along with the top section of the 21st Brigade's battle zone. The 2nd Bedfords were organised with the 2 forward positions held by C Company in the north and A Company in the south. B Company provided the counter-attack company just to their rear, and at the back of the position, the Battalion Redoubt was called Stephen's Redoubt and was due north of Etralier, being occupied by D Company and the battalion headquarters. And the 2nd Royal Scots Fusiliers occupied the Points and Edwards Redoubt in divisional support. In the 21st Brigade's battle zone, directly to the south of the Bedfords, the 17th Manchesters held the Northern Goodman Redoubt, with the 2nd Yorkshires in the Southern Stanley Redoubt. And so, as darkness fell on the 20th of March 1918, all the troops on both sides could do was wait. The assembling German troops had seen more than enough evidence, just from the sheer volume of men and material being moved to the front, to know that the assault was just hours away. In the British lines on the other side of no man's land, unusual levels and types of activity had been recorded since early February, but since the 18th of March, interviews with German prisoners made it clear that the German attack was almost certainly planned for the first day of spring, the 21st of March. By early in the morning of the 21st of March, a heavy mist had descended across the battlefield, which had quickly developed into a thick blanket of fog. Despite the lack of visibility, at 2:30 in the morning, a British counter-preparation bombardment started, directed against suspected areas of German troop concentration, while British patrols struggled to find their way around no man's land in the thick fog. The journalist William Moore's book See How They Run, from 1970, recorded the experience of one such patrol. Conveniently, they were from the 90th Brigade. A score of soldiers of the 16th Manchester Regiment were sitting disconsolately around the rim of a large shell hole in no man's land. The younger ones looked anxiously at the veterans. The veterans either remained impassive or gave an encouraging wink, but it was no use pretending they were lost. The world ended just a few yards from where they sat, waiting for their officer and his sergeant to finish a discussion that seemed to go on for an age. The fog had not been too thick when the patrol set out to explore the enemy wire opposite Saint-Quentin, but gradually it had thickened and obscured nearby landmarks as well as the stars. Dawn was an hour or so away. Eventually the shell hole conference ended. It was decided that they would stay where they were and see if the fog eased or whether they would be able to get some idea of their position at daybreak. Cold and damp, the men settled down. wiping condensation from their weapons and peering vainly into the gloom while they waited. At precisely 4:40, an overwhelming, unendurable tidal wave of noise shattered the stillness of the early morning and roared over and past them. Panting, shaking, they hurled themselves to the earth and lay stunned as shells whistled, groaned and screamed over their heads in the unbroken, thunderous bedlam of the German barrage on the British lines. For 10 minutes the terrified Manchester men clung to the pulsating earth. Then the sergeant hammered on the shoulder of his officer and bellowed in his ear, "At least we know which way to go now, sir." At 4:40 a.m, the massive German artillery and trench mortar bombardment opened. Through a systematic programme searching out targets as far back as 8,000 yards into the British lines, the terrible destructive power of 10,000 guns unleashed a combination of high explosive, shrapnel and mixed gas onto the waiting British troops, their gun batteries and the supply lines. 8 minutes later, the manned battle stations order arrived at battalion headquarters all along the line, and despite the bombardment, all units of the 2nd Bedfords reported as being in their positions between Savy and Etreilles by 6 a.m. Just after 5:30 a.m, both battalions in the 30th Division's forward zones reported that the gas bombardment had started, and high explosive shelling followed in the next hour. The German assault was definitely coming. By 7 a.m, the bombardment moved to the forward zone redoubts, the woods including Savy and Holnon, and any potential concentration areas. Although the gas shelling had stopped by 8 a.m, the valleys were lying heavy with gas for hours afterwards, making troop movements a hazardous business. At 9:40 a.m, German troops were spotted crossing the line of observation in the forward zone, although SOS flares intended to bring down the British barrage were useless, as heavy fog obscured them from the artillery observers further back. The infantry in the forward zone had become isolated and trapped by the fog, so had no choice but to fend for themselves. At 10:30 a.m, the 30th Division's forward zone redoubts reported that German infantry were already among them, their approach having been completely hidden by the fog until they were right on top of them, and intense close quarters fighting broke out. Outlying posts which had not been destroyed or overran rejoined the company redoubts, and German infantry repeatedly broke into defensive cordons, only to be thrown out again, often at the point of the bayonet. By 11 a.m, the Manchester redoubt in the 90th Brigade's forward zone, held by Lieutenant Colonel Elstob's 16th Manchesters, reported that they were heavily pressed from all sides and that German units were streaming past the redoubt on both sides, headed directly for the battle zone. 15 minutes later, the first German troops attacked along the entire 30th Division's battle zone. In the 2nd Bedford sector, unseen in the thick fog, the elite stormtroopers cut the wire and started throwing bombs before the defenders even knew they were there, with a handful of them even getting into A Company's trenches on the right. Soon afterwards, a heavy German barrage hit Savy and the 2nd Bedford sector as they started softening up the defences for the imminent infantry assault. At 11:35 a.m, the 61st Division, to the north of the 30th Division, advised them that their main battle line had already been pierced in parts following the intense assault. By midday, the forward zone redoubts started falling. The 36th Division advised that their forward zone had been overran, and although the redoubts were still fighting, the last message received from the 15th Royal Irish Rifles hovering Racecourse Redoubt was received at 11:45 a.m. According to the 90th Brigade diary, Lieutenant Colonel Elstob's 16th Manchesters reported that most of his men were hit and that he feared he could not hold out much longer. More German infantry arrived to engage the battle zone defences from midday onwards, as the fighting grew in intensity, although the entire 30th Division line remained intact. Within the hour, the entire 18 Corps battle zone was engaged as the fog finally lifted, albeit far too late for the British machine guns and artillery batteries to unleash their own carefully planned defensive fire. Although several miles away from the Bedfords, events to the north and the south would have repercussions as the battle developed. At the southern end of 18 Corps line around Essigny and the northern flank at Maissemy, German troops had penetrated the battle zone line at the critical points where the neighbouring corps were in touch with one another. As a result, the northern flank of the 61st Division to the north of the Bedfords and the southern flank of the 36th Division to the south of the Bedfords had both been turned, and defensive flanks were formed to face the attacks directed towards their open flanks. A cavalry brigade was rushed into the gap in the north to stem any further advance, but the south proved more of a problem. Before 1 p.m, German troops were spotted entering Conticourt, just half a mile from the wooded River Somme Valley, and as the British artillery battery in that area saw no infantry in front of them, they destroyed their guns and retired when the German troops drew near. With hindsight, the gap had been caused by a confused and overlapping set of orders. One company from the 108th Brigade's Reserve Battalion had been ordered into that position by 36th Division's headquarters, but their orders had inadvertently been countermanded within an hour when the entire battalion was moved to the southern flank of the division lines when contact had been lost with the 14th Division to their south, who had been seen retiring. Finding Conticourt empty, German troops had taken the gift and pushed on with their advance, moving along the unguarded wooded River Somme Valley and penetrating into the gap between the south of the 30th Division and the north of the 36th Divisions. On the southern boundary of the 36th Division, German troops drove a wedge between them and the 14th Division to their south, and although the advance was stopped by 4 p.m, their battle zone was compromised enough to make it indefensible. Seeing that the German attack was now developing fully, the 20th Division in GHQ Reserve was ordered to concentrate around Hulme to the west at 1 p.m, in readiness to cover the expected retirement to the reserve line. About the same time, all along the 30th Division's lines, German troops could be seen massing for an assault and British artillery finally having targets open fire. Heavy fighting continued unabated in the division's sector, and around 2 p.m. Germans penetrated into Savy Quarry in the 21st Brigade area to the immediate south of the Bedfords, as the two forward zone redoubts some miles to the east continued to hold out against relentless assaults. After a counter-attack failed to regain Savy Quarry, British artillery was turned onto it, and corps reported 1,000 German troops unawares, causing many casualties amongst them as they rested and waited for orders. In the 30th Division's forward zone, the 2nd Wiltshires in the 21st Brigade sector held out until around 3 p.m, and at 3:22 p.m. the last message was received from Lieutenant Colonel Elstob, whose 16th Manchesters was still holding Manchester Hill. Acting Brigadier Points wrote in his personal diary that the Germans captured all of the brigade's forward zone, and I quote, "except Manchester Redoubt, which gallantly held out until around 4 p.m, when I received the last message from Colonel Elstob to say that he could not hold out much longer and that practically everyone in the redoubt was either killed or wounded and dead beat. This was the last message I received from him. They had made a magnificent fight of it." Although not in the Bedfordshire Regiment, it is worth digressing a little to mention this indomitable looking man, Wilfrith Elstob. The 29-year-old Wilfrith had been a schoolteacher before the war and became a remarkable leader during it. Initially enlisting as a private in the 16th Manchesters when war broke out, he was commissioned almost instantly. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 saw him wounded twice, be awarded the Military Cross for his leadership, and become the Lieutenant Colonel in command of the entire battalion. The following year saw him command a brigade temporarily, and the award of the DSO followed, again for his incredible and fearless leadership during the Third Battle of Ypres. Addressing his men on the way into the forward zone in March 1918, and knowing they were about to be attacked, he simply announced, "Here we fight and here we die." And they weren't just hollow words either. He fought alongside his men with rifle, bomb and bayonet, being wounded during the fighting 3 times according to eyewitnesses. A survivor recorded that during the final German assault he was asked to surrender by a German soldier and simply shouted back, "Never." Lieutenant Colonel Elstob was killed soon after his final call to Brigadier Points, when he remarked without drama, "We are finished, goodbye." No one knew of his death for certain for many months until letters from surviving Manchesters who had been taken prisoner started to filter through. After the war, his good friend Hubert Worthington visited Manchester Hill more than once, including taking a team with him from the Imperial War Graves Commission to dig the hill and look for his friend's body. Ultimately, his remains were never found, although his friend's relentless pursuit of the truth behind the fight led to the posthumous award of a Victoria Cross to add to his DSO and Military Cross. What a remarkable man. Anyway, back to the battle zone. In the south of the XVIII Corps sector, the breach around Essigny and the weakened position this had caused were now considered to be critical. At 3:45 p.m, the 36th Division received orders to form a defensive flank with the last of the division's reserve battalions, which stabilised the position for the time being anyway. Back in the 90th Brigade area, just before 4 o'clock, 5 waves of German infantry attacked the 2nd Bedford's forward companies between Savy and Savy Wood behind a heavy barrage. The attack was stopped in its tracks by intense machine gun fire that was soon joined by trench mortar and rifle fire, sending the survivors back into the outskirts of Savy village before they broke and ran into the shelter of the valley beyond. XVIII Corps, perhaps more in hope rather than expectation, ordered the withdrawal of the forward zone redoubts overnight, but very few survivors returned from the forward zones, as those left fighting inside the redoubts at the time the messages were sent stood no chance of breaking out. Although the German attacks kept coming in the 30th Division sector, they petered out as dusk approached, and at 5:45 p.m, following an afternoon of bombardment from British trench mortars, the 17th Manchesters retook Savy Quarry along with 24 German prisoners and repatriated 12 British captives. Around the same time, the 2nd Bedfords B Company counterattacked the German troops who had entrenched themselves in the right section of A Company's defences that morning. Heavily reinforced by that point in the day, the attack was a costly failure, and the 2 remaining platoons from B Company, not already committed, were moved in to strengthen A and C Company's fighting lines. Reports had been coming in of a concentration of troops and guns to the division's front, especially around Savy and Holland Wood. And sure enough, as dusk arrived, the divisional line was subjected to a renewed, intensified series of assaults, with attacks breaking into the battle zone defences only to be thrown back out again with heavy loss. German assaults against Rupee in the 21st Brigade sector, with supporting attacks on either flank, saw limited German success but at an enormous cost to the attackers. The 2nd Yorkshire's 2 front companies were driven in during the fighting, and a counter-attack failed to recover the ground. The carnage continued when a German assault against the forward company redoubts was broken with heavy loss to the assaulting troops yet again. 30th Division headquarters requested support for the first time that day, and the 18th Battalion of the King's Liverpool Regiment were allotted to the 90th Brigade to bolster their shrinking numbers. As night fell and the fighting raged on, orders for a deliberate and ordered withdrawal were issued. To the south of XVIII Corps, 3 Corps ordered a withdrawal to their rear zone defences lining the Crozat Canal from midnight. The reserve 20th Division's 2 remaining brigades were ordered to form a defensive screen lining the rear zone to enable retiring units to pass through them. The 36th Division in XVIII Corps' southernmost sector were to withdraw behind the River Somme and form a purely defensive flank, the intention being to fight it out in the battle zone to the north of their line. To support them, the 61st Brigade of the 20th Division was attached. When fighting finally died down for a few very short hours, from north to south the division's lines were in fairly good shape. The 2nd Bedfords had lost a small portion of A Company's front sector. The 17th Manchesters had intact lines and plans were afoot to retake Rupee. The 2nd Yorkshires had both of their front companies driven in, but the lines were otherwise intact. All divisional reserves were fully committed, and the 18 Corps reserves were also fully committed. The fog had provided an enormous advantage for the attacking German troops and had doubtless saved thousands of casualties on their side. But by the day's end, German losses nevertheless stood at around 40,000, slightly more than they had inflicted on the British. The shelling and sniping continued all night, as did the German troop movements, as they busied themselves in readiness for the following day's operations. The river valleys on the northern and the southern flanks of the Corps sector would prove weak points, as German stormtroopers continued trickling along the sheltered slopes overnight and would be in a position to cause problems on the flanks the following day. And with that, the first day of Operation Michael came to a close. The British had lost their entire forward zone, and although the battle zone was already in imminent danger of collapse, the decision was taken for the 30th Division to hold their sector the following day and to resist for as long as was physically possible.